So I was browsing the internet this Labor Day weekend, in between working and traveling to visit relatives, when I came across an article on Slate entitled, "What White Catholics Owe Black Americans." Now, of course, I figured this was the typical run-of-the-mill kooky Slate article, but I gave it a look, and sure enough, this article was a very run-of-the-mill defense of slavery reparations. They all have the same form, a sort of hand-wringing over historical grievances, then some kind of vague hook that indicts the larger white American identity, usually something concerning redlining or unfair distributions of veteran benefits, and then finally some soaring rhetoric about how we can overcome this if only we had the courage to embrace reparations. Notably missing, of course, is any discussion of how reparations would actually be achieved. I had seen this form 1,000 times, and I felt like I had to contact the author to really understand what was going on. I mean, he must have some idea. The guy was a professor. He had tenure at a major university. He had to have some idea beyond just the boilerplate propaganda for reparations, what this all meant. So in fact, I did tweet at the author of the article, Matthew Kressler, asking him for details on the implementations of reparations. And sure enough, he was nice enough to tweet back, and he said, well, in fact, there have been people who've laid out the specifics. And he forwarded me 2 articles, one famously by Ta-Nehisi Coates, which I'd already read, and another by a Georgetown-affiliated professor, Tressie McMillan Cotton. But, of course, wouldn't you know it, these articles that were supposed to explain everything about the implementation of slavery reparations were a repetition of the exact same form I pointed out, a lot of hand-wringing over the evils of slavery, a sort of hook to make the modern audience feel guilty, and then finally just vagaries about what these reparations actually were meant to accomplish. And I have to say, I was incredibly frustrated. I tweeted back at Matthew Kressler, but this time he was much more reticent, and the conversation kind of fell apart. But it left me thinking, how could people this intelligent be advocating reparations, a policy that seems so manifestly stupid? I mean, these are not dumb people. We've got Matthew Kressler, a tenured professor. We have Ta-Nehisi Coates, a MacArthur Genius Grant recipient. And then we have another professor, Tressie McMillan Cotton. And they're essentially advocating a policy position that has no implementation, has no benefits that can be manifestly predicted or even argued for. And I had to come to the conclusion, they don't actually believe slavery reparations will work. They don't actually believe slavery reparations are good. Nobody does. So I can already anticipate a huge critique coming from my progressive viewers when taking on this subject. Why am I so ready to cast aspersions on the motives of my opponents? Usually, I'm very willing to hear people out and argue in good faith, and I think it's a really bad form to assume people are lying or being dishonest. And sure enough, I think that is generally a very good policy. And for the most part, when it comes to progressive policy goals, I understand that it comes from a genuine place of concern for the poor. A place that I share. I think a lot more needs to be done to help the people who are underprivileged and find themselves in situations of poverty. But on this particular issue, I just can't accept that we are actually experiencing a genuine debate over the subject of reparations, or a genuine side that believes reparations will actually improve the state of the country. And that is because the case against reparations is so overwhelmingly solid, and the dangers of implementing reparations are so completely unavoidable that I can't imagine anybody who's more or less educated could look at these problems and think that this policy is a good idea. Now keep in mind, I'm not going to back off from my original resolution. I am actually saying that I don't think anybody who's moderately educated actually believes reparations are a good idea. And if this isn't the case, then I will take the video down. If somebody is willing to come on and debate any of the points I make in this video and convince me that they actually believe these things, I will take this video down. But in the meantime, I'm going to lay out things that I think any intellectual person must know about reparations that totally prohibit its implementation as a policy that would actually improve the lives of people who live in the United States of America or in the world as a whole. So without further ado, here are 6 absolute defects of slavery reparations that advocates or intelligent advocates must know. Or rather, this is why I believe nobody actually thinks slavery reparations are a good idea. So number 1, reparation advocates must know that there is no clear group they can take reparation money from and no clear group they can pay reparation money to. Now, obviously, reparations wouldn't be reparations if you did not take money from racial groups like white people associated with benefiting from slavery and discrimination and give it to the descendants of slaves and people who suffered under Jim Crow. This, in fact, is a racial system for taking money from some groups and giving it to the others. But in our current multiracial age, in our intersectional reality of a multicultural America, who is black? A lot of white people have fractional African DNA, and a lot of black people have an enormous amount of their genetics coming from European peoples. This is a very real problem. How is the policy going to be implemented? Are we going to go back to blood quantums? Are we going to have to test every baby at birth to figure out whether he's sufficiently African American enough to benefit from the reparations scheme that we have continuously being implemented? Sean King and Rachel Dolezal will probably be out of business. But I ask this every time to reparations advocates, and there's no answer. Now, of course, some reparations advocates will sort of step back their position and say, well, by reparations, we don't really need to care about who's black and who's white. This is just a general anti-poverty proposal. It will sort of benefit everybody. It'll go out to the society in general. No, that is total hogwash. I know that reparations cannot be a general poverty relief program for 2 reasons. The first reason is we already have poverty relief programs in this country, and they're actually not all that hard to politically advocate for. If progressives want another poverty relief program, they could easily just advocate for it, and it would be a lot easier than asking for reparations. Secondly, any poverty relief program will never be considered reparations in hindsight. It'll always be cast as something that benefits society uniformly, and the impetus to ask for additional reparations on top of that will persist after the passage of that poverty relief program. It won't be considered reparations unless it explicitly takes money from the descendants of people who benefited from slavery and gives it to the descendants of people who suffered under slavery and discrimination. That's the definition of reparations, and that is of the policy being debated. That definition requires a strong dividing line between white and black, and that will have to be enforced. Advocates of slavery reparations know this. Number 2, reparation advocates understand that reparations cannot rectify the structural roots of racial inequality in this country. Now, this is very simple, and I think it's really apparent to anybody who is not progressive. But I think it should be obvious at this point even to progressives because we've been dealing with the consequences of it for almost 50 years right now. The African American community is dealing with huge cultural and family structure problems that seriously impede its ability to accumulate wealth and transfer that wealth intergenerationally. The African American community has very little actual capital that it can move from generation to generation. And furthermore, the illegitimacy rate in the African American community is enormous and it's growing. The current illegitimacy rate is 72% for African American families. That's enormous. There is almost no way to overcome this strictly through government means. Now, I think here we might be able to do a little bit of a thought experiment for progressives who might be pushing back on this. So let's just think about this. What dollar amount would you place? How much benefit do you think you have gotten from having an intact family or having a father that's been present in your life? I might lowball it to be somewhere around $1 million, but, I check a few sites concerning net worth of people who are from affluent communities, which is usually around $300,000 or so, and compare it to people in lower income communities who have effectively zero net worth. So let's just say we have a lowball that your family, your intact family with contact with a father, that's worth about $300,000 over the course of your lifespan, just in pure money. Okay, so now let's say that slavery reparations' goal was just to rectify the problems the African American community has with fatherlessness. Okay, so we know that there's about 37 million African Americans in this country, 12% of the population roughly. And we also know that the illegitimacy rate is 72%. Now, we're going to reimburse them monetarily the losses they would take over the course of their lives for not having that intact family. So we multiply through by our $300,000 lowball, and we get approximately $8 trillion. Just for comparison purposes, that's twice as much as our total national budget, which is $4 trillion, and about half as much as our gross domestic product, which is $16 trillion. This quantity is totally unpayable in any realistic scenario. Imagine that. We would just have to shut government down, double taxes, and do nothing but pay this money. And that would only rectify the specific harm that comes from family structure in the African American community. That doesn't take into account any of the other myriad problems that African American families suffer in the contemporary dispensation. And I know people like Ta-Nehisi Coates and Matthew Kressler have seen numbers like this. They're smart people. They must be doing the math on this. They must understand that the quantity of money that they need America to pay in order to rectify these problems is not even theoretically achievable. All right, I think I partially made my case, but I need to bring in one other concept that is a really important factor, and it's something that conservatives very, very often don't take into account. That is the dirty word of capital. Now, I'm probably going to have to do a separate video on capital and why it's something that conservatives and traditionalists need to take into account. But here I'm just going to focus on the individual problems of capital in the African American community, especially with regards to family structure. Now, a lot of times we think of a family as like a discrete benefit that children have. And indeed it is. Like I said, I think it probably provided me with $1 million worth of benefit over the course of my life. But in addition to that just one-time benefit, the benefit it's going to give in my life, families are also a mechanism by which capital, or money that makes you more money, things that generate money for you, is transferred from one generation to the other. Families are a way that you can pay communities money. And the money isn't just spent and runs immediately out of the community. It actually becomes something that makes more money. It becomes sustainable wealth. Capital is essentially the way people stop being poor after they get some amount of money. This is the reason why a small business person who's up and coming can turn a $30,000 loan into a business that keeps on making his descendants wealth, and how a person who wins a one-time jackpot of $1 million ends up blowing it on four-wheel vehicles and jet skis. When you look at a community like the African American community that has its family structure essentially destroyed, we are witnessing a community that has very, very little ability to hold on to capital. That means discrete one-time payments you just give to people without any sort of mechanism to fix the underlying problems will be spent within that generation and flow right out of the community. I'm reminded always of the picture from Greek mythology of the Danaids, who had to eternally fill up an urn through which they would wash away their sins they committed in life. Unfortunately for them, the urn in this case was filled with holes, and no matter how much water they brought to it, it would always flow empty, and this was their eternal punishment. The bottom line is that if you have a mechanism that causes no significant growth or no ability to hold on to money in a community, pumping money into that community without any plan to fix the problems isn't going to do anything. Or I should say, it's not going to do anything unless you're something that benefits from the constant flow of water into the system. Number 3, reparation advocates know that reparations will forever undermine liberal individualism in favor of ethnic solidarity and identity politics. This one's a lot simpler than the previous one, but it's just the question, what does this country look like after we pay out $8 trillion for what amounts to ethnic grievances? We're not paying them to people who've taken specific damages. We're not paying them to people who have particular crimes done against them by the current government. We are paying them to descendants of people who have historical grievances against another person. We've essentially admitted on a very large scale that the individual achievements of people in this country are really very secondary to the ethnic group they belong to. This will only be further exacerbated by the very necessary step brought up in point 1, which is that reparations will necessitate some kind of formalized genetic distinction between who is white and who is black. This will create an instant demand to be as black as possible and to flee from whiteness whenever possible. It will create an unending resentment in the people who are unlucky enough to be termed white and condemned to have to pay the reparations. And it will create a sense of entitlement in the people who are wealthy already but were deemed black. There's no going back from this. Once we've gone this route, every single group in this country will be convinced that the dominance of their ethnic group is the only way to achieve fairness, and it will lead to an immediate coarsening of American politics. I hate to always be using the alt-right as a boogeyman, but once you actually start charging lower income and middle class white Americans so they can pay off prominent black celebrities for reparations, I'm sure the neo-fascist view of an ethno-state is going to start looking a lot more attractive to those people. Number 4, reparations advocates know that past collective reparation attempts have not worked or have backfired. This is another super simple question that I can't believe intellectuals who advocate for slavery reparations haven't asked. Whenever I think of a large policy that might correct something or might do some good, but we don't really have good statistics on, I always ask myself, well, did somebody do this in the past? And if so, did it work or did it totally fail? This is sort of the question I wish we had asked ourselves before we invaded Iraq or invaded Afghanistan. But it behooves us to ask, did attempts to make reparations for past crimes actually work, or have they not been so successful? And it's undisputable. If you look back in the 20th century, attempts to make reparations have typically not worked at all. For instance, even the word reparations, just put that into a Google search without modifiers. If you ignore the entries on slavery reparations being proposed, the first thing you get are the required payments from the Versailles Treaty after World War I that required the Weimar Republic in Germany to pay reparations to the Allies. How did that work out? Not well. It created a huge grievance among Germans, and it all had consequences that at this point should be all too obvious. And of course, similar reparations can also be seen failing in countries like Zimbabwe and South Africa. The bottom line is that large schemes to take money from one community and give it to another don't really actually ultimately cause communities to come together and form one unified country. Every time two ethnic groups that have warred with each other come together and form a whole, it is always by emphasizing common elements, of emphasizing unity, of emphasizing national and religious symbols. It is never from some scheme that seeks to litigate past grievances that are 200 years old. This is obvious. You see it again and again in history, and it's clear evidence that this reparation scheme being proposed will not work. And again, there is no way that the educated advocates of slavery reparations do not know this already. Number 5, reparation advocates know that reparations will elevate ethnic dominance as a political priority worldwide. Now, there's a dirty little secret in international politics that you won't get from talking to anyone from foreign countries. But if you know them for a while, they will admit this. And that is the simple fact that foreign countries, European, Asian, and African, look to the United States as an indicator of what modern countries do. They mimic our policies, they mimic what we do and see it as a guide for becoming a more modern and advanced economy. Now, what happens the second the United States endorses the fact that 200-year-old grievances can trigger payments of over half a country's GDP? In that world, the United States will essentially have nominated ethnic dominance and historical control as primary mechanisms for governing a country's fiscal and economic future. In other words, it will be a mad dash of different ethnic groups to control the narrative of who is oppressed, and then use that as mechanisms for extracting reparations from their rivals. Another thing that Americans don't often realize. Now, it is absolutely true that in the United States, slavery is a unique historical crime that does not have a rival. No other ethnic group has experienced that, and it is in some ways unique. But the little secret is that when we look broadly at world history, across all countries, across Asia, Africa, and Europe, things like chattel slavery aren't uncommon at all. They're the norm. Here, for instance, I just selected a country at random. You'll have to trust me on this, but I drew Nepal. Okay, what do we know about Nepal? Usually I think this place as being the peaceful home of Kathmandu, and I think Mount Everest is there. But open up the Wikipedia page. Let's see. Oh, wow. They had a bloody civil war. I'm sure there are people who want reparations for that. Ethnic conflict. And whoa, look at this. They didn't legalize slavery until 1924. They're ripe for a reparations scheme. Oh, I just wonder which ethnic group is going to get it? Because I'm sure all of them have it. All of them have grievances. And the solution will be, I'm afraid, war. The fruit of a world where reparations can be used to extract enormous payouts is a world of endless ethnic struggle, war, and bloodshed. And if you look at history, if you look at economics, if you understand incentives, there's no way the intellectual advocates of reparations don't know this. Finally, 6. Reparations advocates know that reparations can never actually be considered paid. There is no way that any payment, even the ridiculously large payments I laid out as a hypothetical, could ever be considered restitution for the crime of slavery. There is no way that any cash payment will ever convince people in their minds that what their ancestors experienced is no longer relevant. If reparations do work, and we are able to somehow slingshot the African American community from a place of poverty to a place of prominence, it will forever communicate in the minds of African Americans that using this historical grievance is the way to essentially make their community grow in wealth. They will therefore be forever reluctant to give up or to agree that the payment for slavery had ever been completed. If reparations do not work, that will be seen only as further evidence that the amount paid was insufficient and that further payments are needed in order to fully heal the wounds of slavery. Either way, the problem and issue of slavery reparations can never actually be closed once it's opened. It will always be a continuous drain on the American project, regardless of how well it works at alleviating the African American community's problems. Now, I've thought of this for some time, and I am convinced that there is no amount of money that I would not personally pay if I could be assured that my descendants would be free from claims of grievance due to the past of slavery against African Americans. And I don't even have slaveholding ancestors. But the fact of the matter is that there is no amount of money that will ever accomplish that. And suggesting otherwise is not true. And I will suggest at this point that it is an untruth that the people who advocate for slavery reparations are fully aware of. They are fully aware that what they are saying is not true, that what they're selling America is in fact a lie. Now, at this point, I'm aware that what I've laid out in this talk has probably been one of the most confrontational videos I've ever made. I've accused an entire position of lying to people. I've accused specific intellectuals of lying. I've accused Ta-Nehisi Coates of lying. I've accused Therese McMillan Cotton of lying. I've accused Matthew Kressler of lying. And in fact, I sincerely believe that these people are abusing their positions as educators. They're abusing their position as public intellectuals. And they're manifestly saying things that they don't believe. Now, this video is more of a challenge than it is an actual permanent video of this site. I fully expect to be challenged on this video, and I'm hoping to be challenged. And I want to make this very, very clear. I will take this video down if any intellectual advocate of these policies is willing to come on my channel and actually discuss these issues with me and convince me that they actually believe that slavery reparations is a good idea for this country. Not they believe that there's some debt that needs to be paid in the abstract. Not that they believe in some hypothetical imaginary world slavery reparations could be a good idea. I want them to convince me that they believe that slavery reparations would be a good idea to implement in our world, realistically, answering the 6 points that I've laid out here. And if they can convince me that they sincerely hold this belief in a discussion, then I will take down this video. In some ways, the presence of this video on my channel is sort of a barometer of the blight that infects our intellectual class. As long as it's up, it's an indication that the people who ordinarily write columns for The Atlantic and the New York Times are either unwilling, unable, or just too timid to actually come and discuss their opinions with their detractors. So for the time being, this video is on my channel, but I hope it won't be here for very long.